Good morning. We're now in our fourth week of our current series called Dangerous Prayer. We think of prayer as comfortable and familiar, such as grace before meals that invokes blessing, or traditional devotionals that give expression to faith and provide encouragement for living. However, dangerous prayer requires us to stretch our faith and trust in God, to rely more heavily on His power and presence. In this series, we're also focusing on praying more skillfully, more powerfully, and more effectively. This week, we're going to look at dangerous prayer when it comes to provision, or more simply stated, to money. Our culture reminds us constantly of our need for money in nearly every area of our lives. It tells us that cash is king. We know that Christ is king, and we acknowledge that cash is necessary. Many Catholics particularly seem a little reticent to turn to God in prayer when it comes to meeting their monetary needs. We labor on our own. God actually encourages us to invite Him into our finances. The Bible tells many stories of people who act in concert with God for their provision. Today's beautiful gospel story about the widow's mite, or offering, perfectly illustrates that point. Jesus praises the widow for giving her whole livelihood to the temple treasury and trusting in God to provide for her. Today's Old Testament reading from the first book of Kings tells a beautiful, if somewhat mysterious, story about how God provides when we trust in Him. The first and second books of Kings records the history of the kings of the tribes of Judah and Israel, many of whom were evil. Perhaps the worst was a king named Ahab. God plans to punish Ahab for his wickedness by sending a drought over the land. When the prophet Elijah tells Ahab about this impending punishment from God, he must quickly flee Ahab's wrath and hide. In hiding, Elijah manages to eke out a meager existence as the drought continues. But then God tells Elijah to leave the security of his hiding place and go to a place called Zarephath, where an unnamed widow will give him provision. At face value, this seems like a strange instruction and not much of a plan. Widows at the time were almost always poor, as they couldn't hold jobs or own property. They relied on the charity of others. We pick up the story as Elijah obeys God's commands. In those days, Elijah the prophet went to Zarephath. As he arrived at the entrance of the city, a widow was gathering sticks there. He called to her, "Please bring me a small cupful of water to drink." The widow, identifiable by her garb, is foraging for sticks to make a fire. Elijah's request for water is no small ask in a time of drought. When she generously complies without question, he even has a bigger ask. She left to get it, and he called out to her, "Please bring me along a bit of bread." She answered, "As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked. There is only a handful of flour in my jar and a little oil in my jug. Just now I was collecting a couple of sticks to go in and prepare something for myself and my son. When we have eaten, we shall die." In the devastation of drought and famine, she's resigned to die. And Elijah said to her, "Fear not, go and do as you propose. But first make me a little cake and bring it to me. Then you can prepare something for yourself and your son. For the Lord God of Israel says, the jar of flour shall not go empty, nor the jug of oil run dry, until the day when the Lord sends rain upon the earth. Fear not." It's one of the most repeated phrases in the Bible. It's in there, in fact, 365 times, one for each day of the year. The widow has next to nothing and no hope of anything more. And Elijah tells her to give what she's got to him, all of it. And in return, she'll receive all she will need. This is completely counterintuitive, just like God's request to Elijah. God's ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. So the widow has a decision to make, and she chooses to trust in the Lord. She left and did as Elijah had said. She was able to eat a year, and she and her son as well. The jar of flour did not go empty, nor the jug of oil run dry, as the Lord foretold through Elijah. God provides not only for her immediate need, he provides much more than she could ever imagine. And it's interesting to note that later in the first book of Kings, we read that she's in the middle of a home expansion project. She's gone from destitute to relative affluence. There's two times when it can be tough to trust God with money: when we've got it and when we don't. When I'm struggling, it can be very difficult to believe that giving will open me to the generosity of God's provision. Ironically, it can be even more difficult to trust God when I have amassed some wealth. Statistics show that the more wealth someone has, the less likely they are to give to God in any kind of meaningful way. Whether a lot or a little, we tend to forget that all we have comes from God, and that in giving we're simply returning to him that which he has given to us. God's goal in providing any material provision is to lead us to spiritual provision or wealth. Spiritual wealth comes in two ways. First, it provides us with an ever-deepening understanding of his love for us. And secondly, it provides an ever-deepening knowledge that we can be a source of blessing to others. When it comes to provision, God will often ask us to release the resources we have before we will see his blessing. Money and wealth can bless us spiritually, but only when we cooperate with God in its use. We discern how to cooperate with God through dangerous prayer. Dangerous prayer comes at a cost, and in one way or another, it always pays off.